Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and today my guest is a senior National Intelligence Service executive and a US Marine Corps combat veteran. Over his distinguished career, he's held key roles across the intel community, including as a National Intelligence Collection Officer for South Asia at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Director of Mission Integration at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and National Intelligence Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also formerly the Deputy Director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, as you may commonly know it, where he's played a central role in the US government's investigation of UAP. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Timothy Phillips. Tim, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me here today.
Thank you for coming on. That's only a snippet of your background. You've got, what, a 45-year career in the military and government?
Right. On the 5th of July, I was sworn a second lieutenant of Marines in my parents' living room in Tucson, Arizona. So next month, it'll be 45 years of service.
Wow. So that's a long time to have commit yourself to anything, let alone service in government. And I'm sure many listeners who are based in the States will be thanking you for your service. And what I'd love to do first, Tim, is just get to know a little bit about you and your background. If you want to talk around anything you like, some of those roles, some of the basics of what the jobs were that led you to one day getting involved with AARO.
Sure. I didn't ask for the assignment, to tell you the truth. I knew very little about the subject. It was somewhat strange. One of my last operational assignments is I was a task force director, the GeoInt task force director in Afghanistan and NGA Afghanistan in 2021. And I was there during the collapse of the Afghan government and the destruction of the U.S. Embassy and the evacuation from Karzai International Airport. So I got short-toured. I had to come back to a new job. And I had some friends who worked for the office. It's the office that provides military advice to the Director of National Intelligence. So Lieutenant General Jeff Cruz provided a job when I came back from Afghanistan in a manner that wasn't planned there in August and September. I went to work as his national intel advisor to the military advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. So that's how I kind of landed the job I got when I returned from Afghanistan. And in that capacity, I worked traditional intel, national security type things, trying to keep the DAMA up to speed, and coordinated closely with what we call Title 50, the national intelligence community, and the Department of Defense. Really at the strategic levels, what we were doing, policy, discussion, the interagency coordination process that occurs between the different cabinet officials and the White House to help form U.S. foreign policy. So that's where I was working. Toward the end of that, I was getting ready to retire, and General Cruz came into my office, sat down and shut the door, and I'm thinking, that is never a good thing.
Yeah.
And Jeff asked me a question. He asked me if I would volunteer for an assignment, and he mentioned this office called AARO. And I didn't know what it was. And he asked me if I would consider applying for a vacancy and going through the interview process to become the deputy for this office that was like the government, UAP, UFO hunters. It was very strange to me. But I had a lot of trust and respect for Lieutenant General Cruz. So I said I would. And that's why I first looked into the phenomena and the mission. And I was somewhat impressed. This was a legitimate attempt by the U.S. government to understand this UFO, UAP phenomena. They've been going on for 7 years, since really, even before World War II. A lot of speculation, a lot of attempts by different departments of the government, Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force in particular, they had different attempts trying to understand this phenomena. As it really caught on in the press, there's a lot of interest by the American, I would say the world public, about what was going on. As the U.S. military started to install and operate digitally scanning radars in aircraft that had much better fidelity and sensitivity than prior fighter attack aircraft had, they started to detect things which were always there, but now they were aware of it. And there was a lot of speculation about what was being detected. There were a lot of claims made, sometimes under oath, to members of Congress. There was a lot of video that was improperly leaked to the public without authority by various members of the Department of Defense trying to get the truth out there. And Congress decided to do something about it. As you know, there were different organizations before AARO was signed into law, and I believe that was in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, and AARO was established. AARO was placed in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Initially, the director had worked for the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Security. There was a little bit of friction there. It wasn't working well. So the next year, the law was changed, and the director became a direct support or a direct report to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Had Title 10, and they decided to have a dual reporting chain where you had both the Office of the Director of National Intelligence would select and appoint the deputy director, would be a career intel official, and then the Secretary of Defense would do the selection and nominate and confirm the director, which Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick was the first director. So it was always designed to have a credentialed scientist from within the Department of Defense to be the director, but then to be able to leverage the American intelligence community to have a career intel executive as the deputy. So we can combine those Title 10 DOD along with Title 50 National Intel authorities' capabilities to really understand this phenomenon. Our scope of what we were attempting to do is we were concerned primarily with unidentified, unknown objects operate in proximity to critical infrastructure or operational Department of Defense organizations. That was our sweet spot. That was our real concern. And you'll see that bias in our reporting in the cases that we accepted. There has always been a bias in the community towards national security because we tend to put out surveillance, and protective measures around things that we want to preserve and protect. So that's where you see that collection bias towards national security, critical infrastructure, DoD locations. And if you go to the AARO website, AARO, www.aaro.mil, you'll see on the heat map, you really will see that bias where there is a lot of reporting where the Department of Defense and our allies, we operate because we have the sensors to detect these things. So that was kind of the organization. Another thing that was unique about it is in the law, they gave AARO the authority to access information at any classification level as it was related to the subject of UAPs. There was nothing that was off limits. And one of the things that just astonished me, I've been in the intel community for a long time, and it's common practice, we highly compartmentalize what we do. When you go from one assignment to the next, you're read out of all those programs because you no longer have a need to know, and we want to protect them. It's amazing the access that we had. Nothing was off limits. In fact, there was one of our three-letter agencies was trying to protect one of their crown jewels, and there was reluctance of that agency to provide images to AARO. AARO wanted to include them in a report to Congress, congressional oversight, because it really explained how some of these advanced technologies could be mistaken as something from another world. And we just thought there were a few images that really conveyed that. And we had to get back to the Gang of Eight, the very senior leadership on both sides of the political spectrum in Congress. And we wanted that image. And of course, this particular three-letter agency didn't really want to cooperate. When the director of national, or let's take that back, when the deputy Secretary of Defense found out that there was not immediate cooperation, she had her military aide call that director and basically tell them, give Tim what he needs. And I have never seen anything like that in my, my military and intelligence community that, given us what we needed to understand. As you know, there's special access programs and controlled access programs. These are mechanisms that the Department of Defense and the intelligence community do to compartmentalize and to preserve and protect very, very sensitive programs. Wow. But we had unprecedented access and cooperation from within the government, with our allies, and across all of the branches and departments in the U.S. government, which to me was amazing. It was an honest effort to try to get to the truth and understand this phenomenon. So I just want to let people know there's no one trying to hide anything from us. If they did, we had career law enforcement investigators on our staff. As you can imagine, we had a lot of members from the American intelligence community who are detailed or assigned to AARO to help us investigate these things. When we had witnesses that either we discovered or referred to us, we had combination of law enforcement officers, federal officers, and DOD had some what we call strategic debriefers who know how to interrogate and conduct interviews with people to try to understand their testimony or what they witnessed. So we had a great team, a relatively small team, but U.S. Congress provided us with a very, very adequate budget to go out and contract with the U.S. defense labs, the service labs. We worked very, very closely with the U.S. Department of Energy, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and we had access to all their investigative and forensics capabilities. Often when there was a UAP incident, and we could not get there due to the limited size of our staffs, we were able to actually go out to the local FBI field office, and they would do the forensic examination of the site where there was a UAP incident reported. And what we really enjoyed about that is they followed Department of Justice rules for the curation of evidence. So if there was a UAP reported on federal property, the violation would be trespassing.
Yeah.
So we would have to be able to confirm that. So later on, we would have evidence that could be used in a court of law. So the way we would process a UAP incident is very, very similar to the way you would process a crime scene.
So you made a statement that I know, given the nature of what we're talking about, the UAP, UFO subject, to say if there was someone holding something back from you, you had the powers to go and investigate and get the additional information and data. Is it fair to say, though, there are elements, especially within this conversation, that people will talk about shadowy cabals and all that kind of stuff, but just even at the bureaucracy level, it can be very difficult sometimes to go to an Air Force or a particular compartment and get information you need if you don't even know it's there?
Absolutely. And one of the challenges we had when there would be an incident, the first thing we would have to do is, speculate, go out and research were there any blue programs that could account for that incident. So was somebody flying or testing some new technology that could have been interpreted or misidentified as a UAP incident? It was a UAP to them, but is there somebody in the government to understand what occurred? And that is very difficult to do because we do, protect secrets, technology based on the need to know. We compartmentalize. So you have to be very, very judicious in who you ask and the question that's asked, because they're not going to volunteer information.
Yeah.
But as we were able to build trust with them, the fact that we would protect, their sensitive programs before we published, we would actually have them go back and review it because we're not aware of everything that they're attempting to protect. They would review. There would be a formal process to look for sensitive or classified materials before we would publish. And the office would publish at different classification levels. So there would always be the intent to declassify and publish as much as possible so we could build confidence for the American public and the rest of the citizens of the world. At the same time, there were sensitivities about where we were operating, the type of aircraft or the sensor that detected the UAP that we wanted to protect. In some cases, that information was so sensitive, it was at the SAP and CAP level that we would have to go to the leadership of Congress. We would brief them, but we'd be unable to brief everybody in the committee because they weren't read into those programs. So we would normally have reports at various classification and access levels to protect those national secrets. Now, one of the things that AARO did do is the fact that there was something we didn't understand or a UAP, that itself is not classified. Okay. Where the incident occurred could be very, very sensitive.
So, yeah, carry on.
No. One of the things that people were very frustrated with us is our inability to declassify information quickly. And you saw where people would have these sensational videos, most of it taken with DoD ISR systems, and you would see the flying jellyfish and different things that would be improperly leaked, primarily to the media. That was wrong. People, violated their oath and their access to sensitive material. One of the more difficult aspects of trying to do a security assessment is over the last 20 years, we had the U.S. government and our allies involved in war and terror, and we had a constant parade of units in and out of occupying various forward operating bases all over the world. So someone has a video or we have a report of UAP from 15 years ago, we would have to go back to that site, determine who controlled the site, have them look at the video and say, is there anything there we needed to protect? Persons, places, things, technology, and then go through the formal DoD and IC process to get them declassified. That takes a lot of time. Matter of fact, Congress actually helped us because just recently they had passed a law to provide all of the UAP, UFO holdings the U.S. government has to our archivists. And within the Department of Defense, AARO was tasked to be able to collect and do that declassification of that huge volume of UAP, UFO information that the Department of Defense has. And when I had left, I think we had already hired 10 full-time analysts, and they did nothing but security reviews to seek the declassification of UAP, UFO materials. And for those who may know, AARO is not we don't have original classification authority for UAP information, okay? That would go to the organization, the entity that made that detection. They're the ones who initially classified that. Most of it's derivative classification based off a guide. So if we didn't classify it, we can't declassify it. So we have to go back to the owner, the original person, to go through that administrative process. And you only have one attempt to get it correct. So once you make an assessment and release something that it previously had been protected, you want to get it right the first time. And there's a very elaborate, very bureaucratic process within the U.S. government to get it right. And it will take years. A good example of that would be the U.S., the federal government, the commitment of this current administration to release all the information on the JFK assassination. That's been going on for almost 60 years now. They're still trying to get that information out. But there is a real legitimate attempt by the Department of Defense, based off the guidance from the U.S. Congress, to declassify as much as is possible and get it out to the public.
One of the real big and thank you for the explanations, because they're really good. One of the real big frustrations around that quality of what gets leaked to the public, and I appreciate from a military point of view, I've had multiple guests who have cited they were unhappy at the leaking of videos. For example, the jellyfish video, because it was done through improper channels, they shouldn't have done it, etc. Some folks have alluded to knowing what it was. Some folks have said it's had a more terrestrial origin, albeit classified. Other folks have said otherwise. However, there was an incident, was it last year or the year before, where Russian jets had buzzed US fighters, and within a couple of days, we had HD footage in color of those jets passing each other within a couple of feet. We never get that for any of the UFO or UAP videos released. Jellyfish, Tic Tac, Gimbal, anything we hear about is always FLIR or at a distance, fuzzy blob. It never seems we get anything, yet we seem to get a really good example of the kind of quality of camera some of these aircraft the United States have on them when we saw those Russian jets up real close. Why do we seem to get nothing from a UFO perspective like that?
Well, I'm not authorized to speak for the U.S. government. The executive branch and the president himself, and there are a number of high-ranking cabinet officials who are original classification authorities, can release information on their own authority. So do you remember when the U.S. was having issues with Gaddafi, and there was a terrorist attack at a club in Germany, and some U.S. service members were killed?
I've just been listening to a podcast which covered that, actually, yeah.
And President Reagan released audio tapes of a voice intercept made by the National Security Agency, where we heard the Libyan intel officers report back what had occurred. We had that inside, and to be able to use that at the UN to justify U.S. military actions against Gaddafi, the administration decided to make that public because it was more important to convince the world that the American military retaliation was justified. Our government, when they think it's in their best interest, can move very, very fast. Okay. AARO doesn't have that authority.
Is it fair to say then that there's almost an element of this topic of conversation where the public, given your perspective as national security, and much, if not all of the military have that approach to the UFO UAP topic, there's a thought that from elements of the government, the public aren't owed anything here, and there's no necessity to bring forward HD footage of, for example, the Tic Tac event. Why do the public need to see that, whether it's foreign adversarial tech, blue technology, or something else? Is there an element of that?
I think that's possible. I would agree with that.
I want to bring you around just to talk about Sean Kirkpatrick, Dr. Kirkpatrick. You worked alongside. Did you work directly alongside Dr. Kirkpatrick?
I worked for Sean. It was actually Sean that interviewed me and recommended that I be appointed. He selected me as his deputy. It was a great honor to work for Sean. He was the right person to start the office. Sean started with a handful of people. He had a vision. He was a credentialed scientist. He was pugnacious. He had a vision. And one of the things that I continued after Sean decided to leave the government and I became the acting director is Sean wouldn't hire anybody that was either a real UFO believer or a skeptic. Sean wanted everybody in that office to assess the available information based on the facts, do it without emotion. And actually, we adopted the intelligence community's analytic standards. Okay, after 9/11, there was a new law passed on analytic tradecraft, and AARO adopted those standards as we would go forward with our reports in our assessments of the cases. So, and Sean did another thing that I thought was very interesting, is when we had a case, we pursued it with two tracks. So we had the scientists and the labs that supported them. And then we had the intel analysts, and we had a very senior intel analyst from Langley, who was our director of analysis, who would independently look at the available information of a case and come up with their assessment of what they thought would happen. They would have a reconciliation conference to determine if they agreed or not. 80% of the time we did. But they used it on different tracks. One just used the basic, what we had, in sensors, used scientific, principles and capabilities. And the intel communities just, that those analysts, they used their tradecraft to try to understand an incident. There were times where we didn't agree, would have to go back and pursue a case. Some of the cases we just could not agree on, and we never could, with any degree of confidence, solve those cases. And I think John, the current director, actually had gone public with Congress and actually told them there's things that, we've cases that we've worked that we haven't solved, we didn't understand. So
it's interesting you say Dr. Kirkpatrick's very in the middle, which is when he was appointed, I had heard from some folks that's what he was. He was neutral, and that's what you want in an office like that. However, I think most people listening to this or watching this would say Dr. Kirkpatrick came across as disinterested or dismissive of the topic. And I'm very much one for, if there's a prosaic explanation, that's great. I would love to know it. I'd rather not just treat things as alien or non-human for the sake of it. I want to get to the meat of the truly interesting cases. But it never seemed for Dr. Kirkpatrick there was anything to this or that anything was interesting. And that's how he came across from a public-facing point of view. Is that something you can see why that was?
At times, Sean had an adversarial relationship with the UAP UFO community of interest. He actually did. AARO now clearly understands that the United States government does not have a monopoly on our understanding of UAP. And myself as an intel officer, I thought collectively bringing everybody together would bring in different viable insights to help us understand the case. So I actively looked for special interest groups that had the knowledge and invested time, their expertise and money to understand this phenomenon. There were groups I thought that did excellent academic peer-reviewed science on some of these cases. Matter of fact, some of their tools we adopted. The idea for a mobile ISR sensor platform actually came from a group of scientists who were working out in Long Island, New York, where they had a RV that they fitted with sensors and recording devices. We were looking out there in Long Island Sound. AARO had a system called the Gremlin, which took 40-foot, maritime containers, these shipping containers to move around on heavy lift to get somewhere. And the idea of having an agile, very responsive mobile platform with those types of sensors on board that we could drive to a site relatively quickly to, begin the investigation of the UAP incident. Kind of stole that from the scientists in New York. I thought we read their book. We thought it was a great plan. We actually looked at the sensors in that book. There was a list of sensors they used. We kind of compared it to a lot of the DoD and IC equipment that we had procured. And it's gone to the point now where AARO has actually developed a rapid reaction capability where we can respond quickly. There'd be an incident within hours, within a day. We can get AARO military personnel, or they could get their scientists on a plane with some handheld multispectral equipment and imaging equipment to try to help the force protection folks, security folks understand what had occurred. We found that it was very, very important to close on an incident site quickly so we could preserve evidence. Okay, so we could interview witnesses and get their statements while the memories were fresh. And then we could work with all the local law enforcement. And then we could start looking for other recording devices that may have been in the field of view when those incidents recurred. And then back at headquarters, we're looking at all the national systems that may have detected something and started to establish a track before the event or post after the event. So we can kind of put that incident in time and space and see if we correlate with any other activity that have been reported. Another initiative I think we started is having a larger, group of individuals who could actively observe, detect, and report UAP activities. So AARO was a U.S. federal response to this phenomena. But if you look at the United States, the country is very, very large. And if there is a UAP incident, especially one that actually enters into someone else's backyard, it's going to be a state, local, or tribal response, not a federal government's response. So we started to look at the state fusion centers, local law enforcement, to give them the tools, work with the Department of Homeland Security so they could curate, they could report, and get those UAP incidents to AARO as quickly as possible. If you look at the UAP response plan, and we look at, say, a recovery plan, at that point, it's probably going to be the United States government, the federal government, DOD and the IC providing support to a governor or a tribal authority, because it's going to be in their backyard on territory that they govern. So it'd be a federal response to state, local, and tribal authorities.
I'll just give a little shout out to, I'm presuming, the Tedesco brothers. That's John and Gerald, who are the scientists out in Long Island, who I've hosted a few times now, and their book Nightcrawler, I think, is the one you'll be referencing. So if folks want to know a little bit more about the Tedescos and the work they have done, then definitely go and check out those interviews. Very interesting guys, and they've spent a lot of money getting those RVs up to scratch as well. So not the worst folks to be getting their stuff from them. I want to ask then, and I'm going to ask this really respectfully. It shouldn't come across negative, but from a layman's point of view like mine, how can anyone within the government be confident themselves that you're not deliberately being misled or fed disinformation, especially when we're talking about the UFO topic and, rumors of cover-ups going back 75 to 80 years? Are you always 100% confident what you're being told is right?
As an intel officer, I'm never confident, and I understand human nature and the attempt to deceive. I will tell you that there was a sincere effort by cabinet officials um, for us to pursue the truth. Congress was concerned about the misappropriation of taxpayers' funds. It is against the law to have a covert program that does not follow, United States laws that govern these activities. There's oversight. And AARO had reported to 12 different congressional oversight committees. So we do these things. However, all of those activities are funded by the U.S. taxpayer, and our elected officials ensure that we're doing it properly. We actively, I'll tell you, I will tell you at the cabinet secretary level, at the service level, the department level, at the IG level, I had both the DOD and the ICIGs on speed dial, as well as both as the DOD SAPCO and the IC CAPCO, who are personal friends of mine. We exchange information all the time. A lot of times during interviews, people would come in and claim that there was a alien technology recovery program or exploitation program. Often, these people were not read into the programs. However, there were legitimate programs of record where the U.S. government, with its allies, would actually recover technology that didn't belong to us. Okay, we would do that. These people had improper or distorted understanding of what was going on. We do recover alien spacecrafts, but all the ones that I'm aware of were launched by human beings on this planet. All the materials that we were asked to examine came from, this planet. Were invented here. We found nothing based off its composition that came from, outside of our solar system. And we extensively had blind tests with multiple world-respected scientific labs where we would give them materials and in some cases paid millions of dollars for the analysis to understand how this material was manufactured, okay, and where it came from, what was pedigree, how was it used. But everything that we were given, everything that we examined came from this planet. There were individuals that were lawfully present at some of the test sites that saw some amazing technology. Based off their education, their worldview, they could misunderstand what was going on. They weren't read into the programs. They just saw something amazing. They would come into us. They would give us our statement. We would remind them that the non-disclosure agreements they sign are a lifelong obligation where they could share with us after the conversation was over. Those NDAs were still in effect. We would then go to the archives or the test directors or the agencies or the bases where these incidents occurred and try to understand what happened at that time. When we saw a video or read the test reports, I was always astonished on the accuracy of their descriptions. These were legitimate people. And the way I've had a number of people ask me, why don't you believe the pilots? We actually do. If they can, fly multi-million dollar aircraft and trusted by the government to do so, I've got to trust their observations. Okay. Often, though, those observations are not informed, by the technology or the programs behind them. And that's what we saw. They did see astonishing things, but those technologies were invented and flown by humans. So we didn't find any, covert black program, and we actively did. We had scientists that would have loved to be able to find technology that did not originate in this planet. We searched, we asked, we did everything we could, and a lot of us thought it was probably highly improbable that our government, with our contractors, could hide the evidence of a sentient being or capability from a world not ours, that we were aware of, that we were reverse engineering. And, we went to all of the places where they claimed to be hidden. If you go out to the Nevada test range or Area 51, as referred to in the media, or going out to Dayton, going out to the ranges of New Mexico, we looked everywhere. Many times there would be claims made to Congress, and we would have to go and investigate and look for the alien technology be hidden on those bases. And we were there, we looked, we worked with facilities engineers, we worked with the base commanders, the wing commanders, trying to find any evidence for the truth of these claims. We talked to Lockheed Skunk Works. We talked to IARPA and DARPA, all of the national level labs that are, taking technology readiness levels, 2s and 3s, and trying to engineer a solution and have a workable prototype, at 4, 5, and 6 before we actually field a new technology. We looked, we had many claims. We could not validate any of them. And we actually looked very, very hard. We had great cooperation. It's very hard to prove a negative.
Yeah.
Some people claim because you're in the government, you're part of the conspiracy. We didn't hire people who were there to either prove or disprove anybody's ideology or beliefs. We followed analytic tradecraft. We let the facts and the evidence lead to our assessments. And if we didn't know, we didn't know, but we did faithfully follow every lead that we had, trying to determine if a U.S. government entity, without authorization, without keeping Congress informed, went off and had some rogue operation, to recover and reverse engineer alien technology. We could not find it, and we looked.
And let me say then, if I've got my skeptical hat on and I'm trying to really think about all the options and outside the box, AARO is an office in its infancy still in terms of the US government, how long it's been going and what's came before you. Would it not be fair to say an agency or an organization within the US government or operating outside of, whatever bounds it should be, has 80 years head start on AARO? You're told to go, you mentioned you've been to Area 51 in Nevada, all the lore that goes along with that. And you turn up there and they show you warehouse A, and, Tim walks in and they say, look, actually what you're looking for is this under this tarp, top secret, etc., classified. And you would have no reason to disbelieve them, but you don't see what's under tarp B in the basement. And I'm bastardizing that and I'm really simplifying it. Is there not those possibilities where you're showing one thing with the left hand, but you're not showing the right hand because they have such a long head start over AARO, no matter how hard you're trying to do the right thing?
I understand what you're saying. AARO was aided in investigations by the IGs of both the IC and the Department of Defense, because not only were the claims made to us or the complaints made to us, they also went to the IG. And we collaborated in a lot of those investigations. They do have the forensic financial auditors that can look, go after the money. So money, appropriated funds or not even non-appropriated funds. To do any of this takes money. And we'd look for that fiscal trail. Another thing that would happen if you go into the efforts that we have to protect these covert actions or these sensitive programs, they have to hire personnel. They have to read people in. They've got to read people out. All of that is documented. Okay. Not only did we talk to the current management, okay, we also went back into those who had served there before. Same thing. Sean had an incredible Rolodex based off the community that he came from, the space, missile, and rocket community that he came from. He actually had great insight from the U.S. industrial base, those large manufacturers that have been developing, solutions and technology for the U.S. government for many, many years. And we did do a lot of interviews with retired members. A lot of them were by name conspirators that we had to go out and interview. There was a lot of disinformation. There was a lot of out and out lies. There was some misunderstanding where, yes, they did work on some very, very sensitive programs, but the technology they recovered and reverse engineered was made by human beings, not aliens. And a lot of times you had people that were not actually read into the programs, but had some understanding that a program existed, had imperfect or incomplete information. And we examined those claims. We also had a lot of people that came to us that claimed to have worked in these programs, that signed, non-disclosure agreements, threatening them for life if they were to share secrets. We examined those cases. We went to the locations that claimed they were. We could not find anything, and we did a legitimate search. Also, we did have the full cooperation of the FBI, the Department of Defense, investigative organizations, Office of Special Investigations, NCIS. They all aided us at different times at different locations, depending if it was Department of Navy, Army, or Air Force base or contract that was in question. So we did the best we could. We never know if it did happen or not, and it could, but we're still pursuing those claims. AARO has a secure mechanism where if you're aware of some misbehavior by the U.S. government or its contractors, you can report that to AARO, and AARO will investigate it.
How did you feel during the time you worked there and since you've left AARO, the claims of David Grush coming forward and the claims of recovered materials, recovered bodies and entities, or organics or biologics, I think he said. You've got Matthew Brown coming forward with his statements recently around the war games he found and the information within that. And then you've got Jake Barber, who at the beginning of the year has come forward and talked about retrieving egg-shaped objects and having his own experience. It's one thing to go through all the work you've done and the work you've done with AARO, and you're not turning up blank each time, but you're investigating and you're getting to the bottom of many of these cases. How do you feel and how do you corroborate that with what's coming from the whistleblowers that are coming out?
We were asked by members of Congress quite often to investigate these claims. We never could validate the claims. As a former government official, I'm not here to disparage the reputation of American citizens. We're not a law enforcement organization. We would, based off leads from Congress, investigate things. They're, American citizens. They have a constitutional right to believe what they want to say.
That's fair. And on that, you've just spoken with Stephen Greenstreet from the New York Post, and you've done an interview with him. It's out there online. It's got a lot of people talking. I'd love for you to talk about the one thing that really jumped out to me in a lot of the UFO community, were your thoughts on the black triangles. You
Sure.
found these a particularly strange and interesting part of the UFO topic. Why do you believe these are the most interesting, and why are they so mysterious?
Um, when I was still in uniform, before the F-117 program became public, I was actually operating with the 1st Marine Division out in the Chalky Mountains by Yuma. And we actually sighted those early stealth fighters in the daylight. They're not invisible, and we didn't know what they were. It didn't look like any aircraft we recognized. And we actually had reported it, and we were told it didn't happen, and don't worry about it. It's not your problem. And we understood the rules. Anytime there's something that we can't identify, we don't understand, operate in close proximity to critical infrastructure operating forces, in today's environment, with the increasing lethality and autonomy of uncrewed systems, to me, it's a national security threat. We don't know what it is. We can't identify it. We need to take steps to be able to track it and understand where it came from and who's operating it. There is a small percentage of the cases that AARO research that we could not explain. Some of the phenomena were concerning. If you look at new technologies are emerging or just possibly disruptive technologies. Part of AARO's mission was to prevent technological and operational surprise. When we see something like that, a lot of the speculation by the American public when they were seeing all these unidentified, what they call drones flying around, who's operating them and why. There were some things that we confirmed we were able to detect. They shouldn't have been there. We need to understand who's operating them and why, and be able to control airspace or the waters around critical infrastructure operating forces. The world's just too dangerous of a place not to have that ability. The current director decided to go public and admit that there were things we did not understand. So I'm not saying anything new. The concern about the black triangle, and I did want to clear something. I haven't personally seen one. Okay, I know it said I see why I haven't. I've read the reports. We've interviewed very, very critical force protection officers who have. There are some images. I myself haven't seen it, but because I have in the past, aware of the flying wing, the triangles, I know that is possible and part of the state of the art of operational systems. So that was my concern, is maybe an adversary has perfected an aircraft with stealth characteristics that could operate with impunity in very sensitive protected places. So that's a concern that I would have. And AARO would always respond when we had incident reporting at very sensitive locations, because we'd see that as a national security threat, and that's well within the sweet spot of AARO's mission to respond. It's our duty and responsibility to be able to develop sensors, be able to detect it, and pass that information to organizations that could deal with them.
So on the framework, if you had one in AARO, we have got all these cases that are resolved, or you believe there is a conclusion. There is a small percentage which are unresolved, or you don't know what they are. Is there anything that AARO would work towards that you could say something could potentially be non-human? It seems you've got a checklist for, okay, this is balloon, bird, potentially adversarial technology. Are there anything that you could look for, but obviously never found, that would have indicated something not human?
Okay. Or, I'm a Christian, so I believe in supernatural things. I think there's dimensions beyond the physical world that we live in today. I believe that in different dimensions, the rules of physics as we understand them may not apply. So there could be a dimensionality to some of these incidents that we don't understand. And the things we use to try to detect, measure and observe won't work because they're operating on a with a different set of physics. I don't know. I haven't witnessed that. It could explain some of the cases. These people see things, they believe them. If I wasn't curious and I wasn't honest enough to say, look, I don't know, I'm not I wouldn't have been the right person to serve as the deputy and the acting director there. I think we have to have a little bit of humility that we don't know everything about this phenomenon.
Under John Kozlowski and his stewardship now, what do you see the short-term and long-term impacts of AARO being then?
I think AARO's going to be around for a while. It's a good investment for the U.S. government. They are developing a lot of current tradecraft, working across the different aspects of U.S. government to improve reporting. And they're about to go with a public reporting mechanism to help understand. I had mentioned earlier the collection bias that the DoD has. We really didn't understand what the baseline normal is at places we don't protect. AARO has some amazing analytic capabilities and partnered with the IC with some of their cloud-based services to be able to look at space surveillance radars, air traffic control radars, environmental weather radars, maritime, any sensor that exists to be able in near real time when there's a UAP incident, try to look at all available sensor data to include what the U.S. intelligence community refers to as national technical names. So if we have a sensor and that sensor can detect that incident, try to reconstruct a track, try to understand where it came from and, where it went. So we can help correlate that activity with a report of incidents, or even better, have near real-time reporting where the sensor grid that we built, we have operate at machine speeds with AI. We write algorithms that says if we see these performance characteristics, and we already know what the scheduled airlines are, okay, we kind of understand the signatures of biologics, birds, bats. We filter that out and we start looking for the truly unusual UAP characteristics. I think we could have a better understanding of how pervasive this UAP phenomenon and where it's at, what's its concentration, what's its interest. And we start to understand the patterns a little bit more. We're going to get there. There's been some great work trying to understand all the available data. And I know that the current leadership in the office was going to, work with the UAP community and the other, labs or sensor providers to be able to look for data that could be used to detect, track, and maybe help us resolve these UAP incidents. There is a change in the law where AARO will now be a must-coordinate office when it comes to the detection of work in UAS cases, the counter-drone, because often we would detect drones. If we did, we would want to pass that to the organization responsible for that airspace management protection, either the UVs in the maritime or air, we'd want to do that. We were working with the space community to be able to detect UAPs and at machine speeds process the detection of UAPs in space, especially anything where we'd see an orbit degrade and reentry into our atmosphere. AARO was going to be having a series of war games with the National Space Defense Forum, or community of interest, to kind of understand UAPs in space. AARO had a lot of expertise and success working in the air domain. Did a little bit in the maritime domain, and actually had a definition that was agreed to within the U.S. government of what AARO's role in a UAP in space was. So they're actually going to live up to that all domain task that they have. They have a better understanding of what UAP activity is here, first in the United States and then globally. AARO's doing a lot of work to baseline. You've probably heard about some of our Gremlin, our ground-based active, passive, and active radar UAP, surveillance systems. We've had some of their systems in some national security sites operating for almost a year, just trying to baseline what normal is. AARO has actually responded to provide surveillance expertise and capability to deal with counter UAS issues. So there's a lot more collaboration and cooperation in the U.S. government. We're tackling it as a national security concern, even though I don't recall a single case that AARO worked where there was hostile behavior by UAP. It's something that we didn't see. I know there were reports, the Russians and other people have reported hostility. We didn't see that in any of the cases we worked. So we did approach it since we were a U.S. government and a DOD-IC entity from a national security perspective, because that's where real equity was. We need to understand this phenomenon. And to me, the activity of some of these unexplained cases, we saw where there was an attempt to avoid detection and evade. To me, that's human activity. So I did not see any evidence of any UAP case where there was supernatural activity. There were flight characteristics that we didn't quite understand. Theoretically, it's possible. Were we aware of a fielded system that could operate in that manner? Answer's no. But that's one of the things that AARO's tasked to do. We had a lot of partial signatures that we would work, with our partners, international partners, with across the U.S. government to help develop our understanding of what these unusual new systems are. And I have a bias. I think it's adversarial. We would do the same thing if we had the technology, to have a greater understanding of potential threats and challenges toward our nation. So, and if you look at, what's been going on in the war between Iran and Israel, what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, you're just seeing huge advancement with uncrewed systems, with its increased autonomy and lethality, and it's only going to improve. And until we understand it, it's a UAP, and I think AARO is going to be in business for a long time.
No, I appreciate that answer. And I'd love to finish off with a couple of listener questions for you. I got
Sure.
loads than you can imagine. And apologies, I never put this out widespread to the audience, folks, because Tim, you've been very good arranging this quite last minute. It's been a couple of days now since we arranged a date and time, and I didn't want flooded with questions. You'd have been here for hours and hours and hours. So I've kept it relatively limited. So thanks to the folks who've got questions in. And the first one is from a listener called Tim, long-time listener. He asks, are you aware of the recent Wall Street Journal article for a first part?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Okay. So he says, if so, do you stand by the two main conclusions in the article, which are that Malmstrom Air Force Base incident in 1967 was due to a government security test of an EMP device on an active nuclear missile flight group? And two, most of the people who come forward as whistleblowers with information on this subject were victims of multi-generational hazing by the US Air Force. And if so, how should the government reconcile these two dangerous and negligent abuses of power?
Okay. In Maelstrom, there was a test. AARO actually as doing some research, gone into the archives. I'd actually worked with some of the national labs to try to reconstruct the cascading transformer failure that occurred and the vulnerability we had where the U.S. Missile systems, these retaliatory nuclear systems, were actually connected to the public utility grid. And there was actually some failures where we actually took U.S. missile silos offline due to some engineering principles we didn't quite understand at the time. We thought we had solved it and we hadn't. So that will be out. I think AARO has a story that we're going through to publish. So that's going to explain the Malmstrom case. There were some other parts of that case where there was some UAP reporting. There back then was UFO reporting. Mm-hmm. That we went into the official records and couldn't find evidence of it. It doesn't surprise me, but before AARO existed, there was no guidance from DOD in the form of instructions to be able to report and retain data. That was one of the very important things that Sean and I were able to do, is actually work with the Joint Staff J3 and actually have written published guidance and DOD instructions to the Department of Defense to be able to report UAP incidents and remove that stigma. At one time, you were jeopardizing your security clearances and your job if you worked in the U.S. military or IC and you reported a UFO or UAP case. We want to remove that stigma. We want more people to report and tell us what they see. It may not be a UAP, but it may be something we're very interested in. So we're doing that. The hazing, there was an attempt, or I say there was a program that originated in the Air Force, saying the Special Access Program. So they have managers. We have offices. At each command, there's an office that administers access to these special programs. So you come in, you'd be briefed on it, you'd be told the procedures on how to protect these programs, how you can communicate these programs, what systems you're authorized, to discuss these programs. And then after your tour of duty was up, you'd be written off and you'd sign your NDAs. So there's a very elaborate management system where we track who has access to what information. Some of these programs are so sensitive. Every time you are given access to information, it's signed for either digitally or in the old days, you used to have to sign off that you read that. So we keep track of who had access to what information. The Air Force had come up with a false program to use as a training vehicle to train the administrators in the Special Access Program management offices on how to do this. So the U.S. government has a procedure on how we can track and trigraphs, abbreviations that can talk about a family of programs or specific programs. And I think it was called Yankee Blue was the program of record, and it was a false UAP program. If you read it, it never even talked about extraterrestrials. It didn't talk about UAPs, but it was talking about an anti-gravity motor or engine. And the image was the classic 1950s UFO spacecraft. So this started off as a training aid. Somehow it went rogue, got out into the General Air Force, and another service that we were able to confirm, and was used as like hazing people as they were, came into this duty assignment and left that duty assignment. They were aware of this as a legitimate program of record where they would have to read people in and out. And they, in fact, never knew it was false. So you had thousands of military personnel who believe and who were sworn to secrecy that signed non-disclosure agreement that the U.S. government, had a program where, we were basically exploiting alien technology and we were hiding it with the SAP program. And that's what we were able to determine. And it was amazing. It went on for over 20 years. It was quite extensive. And then we had another interview that I was present for, where we actually had an office that was disseminating images of the classic, UFO flying ships out at Area 51 that was being shared, with a commercial bar out there, a private entity outside the gate. And from what we understand, the effort of this dissemination, program or initiative or operation was to, kind of build a cover story as to what they were actually developing, flying, testing out there in Nevada. So we have, people that with good intentions, maybe without legal authority, did things that are very questionable today. And these things that we're talking about happened 20, 30 years ago. When I left, we never understood if it was something that was directed from headquarters, came from Washington. We don't know. It could have been a local initiative. I left the program and I don't know where they are with the investigation today. But there was some thought that this could have been the seeds or maybe the factual basis for why so many people have a belief that the U.S. government had recovered, and had reverse engineered alien, technology. To me, that's a natural conclusion. How many people believe this and never knew that this was a false campaign or a false SAP?
So I like to pride myself, Tim, on being able to sit on the fence and look at both sides of an argument. And on one side, I can look down and go, okay, EMP stuff, etc., testing out nuclear site. And I'll look down and look at the hazing and go, okay. But I can also look at the other side and go, that seems, one, really dangerous to have done that test like they done. But two, the hazing side of things, even just on an immaturity level, doesn't seem like an entity the size of the US government could or should allow that to happen. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would struggle with both sides of that. But if I would ask you, can you put yourself in the position of someone in the UFO community? You said when you went into AARO, you weren't a UFO person. You never thought much about it. You were neutral. But can you look in the UFO community and see why someone would look at those explanations that were in that article and think they just looked like easy cover-up stories or classic cover-up stories because they worked?
Well, from personal interaction with senior members of Congress, there was outrage over the hazing. As you know, there's been hazing, police departments, high school athletics, in the department or in the Department of Defense for years and years, and it's wrong. There's actually laws against it. I'm not in law enforcement, and if there's violations of laws, they should be prosecuted. That's not my lane. I think it was misguided. I do not know if it was a deliberate campaign to mislead the American people or just some schoolhouse prank that got out of control. I know that Air Force leadership thought that's what it was. It was just a prank that just got out of control. But if you look, and this was actually drawn out to us, if you go to any Air Force base and you go into the post exchange and you go into the gift stuff, you'll see all types of UFO, paraphernalia for sale. There's a whole culture, there's a business that's been monetized. And if you were to build a cover story to protect U.S., programs of record, they did a pretty darn good job, diverting, the attention of the American public. Don't look over here.
Yeah, there's always an argument of what we're not looking at, but I think there's going to be folks on different sides of where that lands. On that, I'd like to ask you about an individual, or Xavier Wood. What do you make of the claims made by Jay Stratton in the film Age of Disclosure's trailer, considering his office, the UAP task force, was issued a National Intelligence Emeritus Unit citation for their work on the UAP issue for the government? And those claims were Jay Stratton saying, there are non-human bodies, non-human craft in possession of the US government.
We did receive a lot of archives since we kind of assumed that mission after Jay's organization was stood down. I saw no evidence for that, and any of the materials that was passed to AARO. I'll let Jay, explain his beliefs. I'm not here to either defend it or criticize it.
And we've not seen the documentary yet either. I don't know. Have you seen it?
No, I really don't follow the social media.
Okay.
I was a regional expert in South Asia and the Middle East, and for 20 years I did counterproliferation and counterterrorism operations.
Yeah,
I wasn't in this mission space.
The documentary's not even out yet. It's literally just the trailer so far. So I imagine it might be one you'll know or recognize many of the congressmen, women, and folks involved. So I'm sure when it comes out, you'll grab a copy. Another question from another Tim, believe it or not. You've said black triangular craft are real and beyond US or allied capabilities, possibly from an adversary. But if that's true, how would you explain sightings of these going back decades without battlefield deployment?
Well, I know that there's been winged aircraft going back to the 1940s. Again, there could be phenomena we don't understand. I can just, report the cases that we worked and the facts that we were able to uncover. There's things that we don't understand. U.S. government has admitted that. We solicit, the assistance of anybody with scientific tools, collection capabilities that or analytical insights that help us understand. We weren't there. It was before, the office I supported was established. And there were a lot of cases like that. And we got considerable criticism when we did our historical report that we didn't look at everything. And we didn't have time. We had a year to get that done. And then the focus was really on U.S. and critical infrastructure and the claims made by people under oath to Congress that the U.S. government was running some type of dark, clandestine UAP recovery and reengineering program. And that's what we really focused on in that report, trying to research those claims.
And I've got two more questions for you. The first from a Human Neutrino. He says, as stated in the Stephen Greenstreet interview, there are black triangles and other craft flying over sensitive sites in America, and they don't know what they are or where they're from. If they come from a near-peer adversary, given the massive intelligence apparatus of the US and the hundreds of billions spent annually on overseas intelligence gathering, wouldn't Tim agree that to miss out on adversary developing this tech over years and decades would be the biggest intelligence failure in American intelligence history? If he accepts that, they would be unlikely to miss a development of that magnitude, then what are the alternative explanations?
Okay. As a Marine officer and as an intel official, I went to a lot of schools. And I can remember a quote from a dead German that to defend everything is to defend nothing. we do have amazing ISR capabilities, but those capabilities are extremely focused to protect what clearly is vital in our national interests. There are things that the government understands that we're not sharing with the public, for national security reasons. We don't want to tip off our adversaries that we understand what they're doing. And I will tell you that there were partial signatures of unusual events reported to AAROs at UAP over a period of years with additional collection, targeted collection, cooperation of the intelligence community. We were able to complete our understanding and gain new knowledge into adversary capabilities. Can't discuss that, but we're not completely blind. We do understand that people want to gain an advantage, and it's a continuous gain with measures and countermeasures. There's always new advancement, new technologies are being fielded. That goes back to that task to prevent technological and operational surprise. Often where these new vehicles, with unusual stealth technologies are detected, are very remote sites where we do have some, important military capabilities, but we're trying to pick thousands of square miles sometimes. And then when we do get tipped that there's a possible threat, that's when we start focusing our effort to get a better understanding and work with the base commanders, the organizations to increase, defensives to be able to detect and counter these capabilities.
And final question, thank you, Tim, is from Dave. He says, does Tim support the passing of the UAP Disclosure Act, or the Schumer-Rounds Amendment, as some folks know it? In particular, does Tim support the civilian review panel element set up to take decisions on classification away from the DoD and IC, who people think are covering the origins of UAP?
Yeah, I think the U.S. government could probably afford more disclosure. As you gain a better understanding of how difficult it is to do the security assessment and declassify. Even if something's declassified, there's another step on public disclosure. So we can declassify, but then you go one more step, and then the U.S. government has to determine, is it in the interest of the U.S. government to disclose to the public? Two different steps. We have to get it right. Because of compartmentalization of sensitive topics in the U.S. government, you want to ensure when you declassify, you do it correctly and you don't jeopardize something we don't understand. That needs to be protected, or we need to protect our friends and allies. Often when we had some detection, the stuff that we detected wasn't U.S. technology. It was our friends who are developing capabilities on ranges, owned and managed by the U.S. So that was the reason for things to be classified. Often when we had pattern of life collection operations, we would just sit there and across the spectrum, hyperspectral collection over a site, we would detect things that the U.S. government did not want to share with the American public. And then we would work with them, to triage and to protect those capabilities, so we could preserve them and use them when it's to our advantage. I think we could, having an organization maybe outside of DoD, but that has like a super user access where they can monitor and provide oversight of what we're doing. When I was at AARO, we had the government audit agency, had almost a full-time staff in our office due to the sensitivity of what we're doing. We're watching. We shared everything with them because we're stewards of the U.S. taxpayers, money, and want to spend it correctly. and wisely. I'm for additional scrutiny and maybe have an independent outside organization or people identified by Congress or the executive to have almost like a GAO internal audit function to be able to, to keep the government honest. I would go with that. I'm not sure how we would administer that, but I'm sure that the government could figure out a way that we could do it, protect what needs to be protected, but share more with the U.S., with the public. We need to do that because we need to demystify a lot of this. In the law today, you can't classify something just because it's embarrassing. That if you look at our classification guides, that's very, very simple. And if you go through the training that every intel officer has to take every year as part of our, intel oversight, that's improper use of classifications against the law. Okay, but we could do more, and I would welcome some type of amendment that provides more independent scrutiny of what we do.
Well, Tim,
so yes,
listen.
I'm for it, but at the same time, what needs to be protected needs to be protected, and it's not because, and this is difficult because I was a government guy. Okay, it's not because the government wants to protect, our knowledge or the existence of aliens from the American people. We never saw evidence of that. Never saw it. And the fact that they're aliens is not something that we would classify. Now, as a senior executive in the U.S. government, if we were to have made such an assessment, that would be communicated to the president, to the executive branch of government. And that's something that they would share with the American public, probably not AARO. We were kind of above our, pay grade, and we would inform Congress, and we would allow those, elected officials decide how they communicated that with the American public, not a government, bureaucrat like me.
Well, Tim, listen, you've been very candid, and I've appreciated your time. There are, of course, going to be people who have listened to you and don't believe it, or they fall on a different side of the argument. You'll have some folks who will have listened and appreciated your candor, but I very much appreciated your time, your answers, and listen, thank you so much. And is there anything you'd want to leave the listeners with, the UFO community, from an AARO perspective, from your own perspective?
You had people, we hired good people. We had just an incredible collection of talent, and people who were trying, to understand this phenomena. And, I will tell you that nobody in the U.S. government told us no or attempted to block what we were doing. Did we make them nervous? Absolutely. Absolutely. But we try to do the right thing. And I hope AARO is able to continue the mission, make people nervous, okay, and understand more about this UAP stuff. But thank you for the time, and all your viewers. Hey, thanks for hanging in there and listening to me.